Hello, this is Principles of Management, MGT 2100 at Northeastern University. This presentation will cover Chapter 1. The first slide covers the concept of what management is, and as it notes on the slide, it includes planning, organizing, leading, and controlling, things that we'll talk about in a few more slides in greater detail. The idea behind management is that there are individuals who are charged with ensuring that the goals and objectives of an organization are carried through via its employees. The slide notes that the goals should be carried through effectively and efficiently. The terms effectively and efficiently come up quite frequently in the business context. They do mean very distinct and separate things. To be effective is to be able to produce a result. To be efficient is to be able to produce that result while using the least amount of resources, whether it be time, money, or people, in order to get the biggest bang for the buck. If you are effective, that means you got the job done. If you are effective and efficient, it means you got the job done and you did it with the least expenditures. Typically, managers that are capable of being effective and efficient together are going to have an advantage over their competition. Managers are the people that are responsible for doing the planning, the organizing, the leading, and controlling of other people. And the resources that they typically have control over or oversight over are human resources, which are people, the people that carry the skills and the experience to be able to do the work. They also have oversight over the machinery, raw materials that are used to create value-added products, computers and other IT resources that are able to make higher levels of productivity. It also includes money, time, patents, which can fall into the area of intellectual property. A patent is essentially an idea that an organization has come up with that is protected by the government for a period of time. You also want to be able to have resources that consist of loyal customers and employees. There is a cost associated with acquiring customers, and if you do a poor job of monitoring them and keeping them satisfied, you will end up losing them, and that will lead to further expense. Same thing applies to employees. They are an important resource, and if you have good employees, you need to take steps necessary to be able to retain them, as turnover does create a lot of time and expense in terms of an investment to replace those employees. If you have a strong employee base, then you will have a strong competitive advantage in the marketplace. Organizations are basically groups of people who work together to achieve some common goal and objective. Prior to the advent of the Industrial Revolution, many people worked on their own, and the whole concept of working together in groups didn't really come about until larger corporations utilized equipment and enabled the possibility of people to work together to achieve business success together. Organizational performance is how well an organization does the work that it's supposed to be doing, and managers really have a high level of oversight in terms of ensuring that the performance is at a high enough level. Again, we're talking about efficiency and effectiveness. Is the job getting done? Is it getting done with the least expenditure of resources? This falls under the controlling aspect of a manager. They should be able to have some type of measurable, some type of metric to determine how well performance is being done. One of the biggest challenges for managers is to ensure that they measure the appropriate things when trying to gauge whether or not a company is actually performing at a high level. If you measure the wrong things, you're not going to have a good feedback in terms of how well the company is performing. On slide 5, there is a quad chart, which is basically a four-cornered box that is used to provide you with some insight when you're measuring one thing in the context of another. In this case, we're looking at effectiveness, which is on the left-hand side, and then the efficiency runs across left to right. In the lower left corner, that's basically the worst of both worlds. You've got low effectiveness and low efficiency. That means you're not really producing what you need to do, and you're not doing it particularly well in terms of the expenditure of resources. If you have low efficiency and low effectiveness, it's typically because a manager has made a decision to do the wrong type of work, and they don't use the resources particularly well, so that the efficiency is kind of out the window. You end up with low quality products or services, and the customers are not going to be very happy and will very likely turn to another competitor. In the upper left-hand corner, you see the consequences of having high effectiveness but low efficiency. That basically means that the manager has chosen to pursue the right product or service, the right path that customers are going to be interested in, but they're not managing the resources particularly well. And the end result is that you'll have a product or service that people want, but that will not be at a high enough level of quality or will be too expensive relative to the competitors' products and services that are being offered, and you will lose sales to them. In the right-hand lower corner, you've got still low effectiveness, meaning that you're probably not choosing the proper goals, but you are at least pursuing it with some level of efficiency and proper management tools. The result here is that you may get a well-produced, cheap product or service, but if it's not effective, meaning that you're not satisfying your customers, they're not going to want to buy it. So the best thing that you're trying to shoot for is in the upper right-hand corner, where you have high levels of effectiveness and high efficiency. The manager has chosen to pursue the type of work, the type of product and service that people want, and they are managing their resources efficiently so that the product or service can be provided at a high level of quality at the proper price point, so that customers will be attracted to it and they will select that product or service over a competitor. Efficiency is largely a measurement. You determine whether or not you are efficient by applying certain metrics to the work that's being done. It's also very closely tied to productivity. If I have 5 employees and I have an established budget, what I could do is change my process, my administrative process, my operations. I could get better equipment. I could get new software that would make them better at what they do for the time that's being spent. And they could actually produce more products or services in the same amount of time for the same amount of expenditure. That would be an increase of efficiency, but you would have to measure what's actually being produced, what type of products are being created, what type of service is being provided, and the level of quality for those products and services. The next slide is just a basic review of why studying management is important. The first thing is that management and business in general is becoming more and more complex as things progress in terms of the interconnectedness of the world and the global economy. The ability to make good decisions, which we will get to in the next couple of chapters, is very important. You want to be able to operate on an ethical basis, both to comply with the law and to be fair to your employees and to your customers. People take note of how well you operate, and they may not want to do business with a company that is determined to be unethical. Organizations that understand the nature of management will be better positioned to put their managers and their employees in a position to succeed. The main point is, if you've got good quality people and you're paying them the proper amount, but you're not giving them enough time or you're not giving them the proper tools because you don't understand the process of management and what's important to it, it's going to be an impediment to success. There are personal economic benefits if you're a good manager. Typically, management means that you've moved up in terms of prestige and very likely income. An average manager in the mid-level is probably earning in the low 6 figures, which is about double what the average employee would make. In addition to the pay, being a good manager means that you will be highlighted for maybe future promotions and even more success in terms of responsibility and income. At higher levels, the difference between an excellent manager and a very good manager are relatively small. So when we get to critical thinking and making decisions, that's going to be one of the big things that differentiates one manager from another. Over the long term, you only have to be a little bit better than the other managers around you before time proves that you are substantially better. If you make 5% better decisions over the course of a year, by the end of that year, you're going to have a very demonstrable difference between the quality of the work that you do and the quality of other managers, which would put you in a good position to be able to step up within the organization. If you're also learning good managerial skills, you would be able to branch off potentially and become an entrepreneur and establish your own business. Because if you understand how management principles work in one context, you could then transfer it to either another job or to create your own business. Just as we'll talk about when we cover critical thinking in another chapter or two, if you learn management principles and apply them on the job, you can also apply them to your personal life and making better decisions putting yourself in a better position to succeed as a manager, well, you can also use those same principles to be able to succeed individually. When you're buying stock or purchasing a house or buying a new car, if you're overseeing your assets, running your household is very similar in many respects to being a manager in a business or running a company. And if you improve in one area, you'll be able to apply it to other things as well. The next slide covers the 4 tasks of management, and it starts with planning. Companies that are the most successful typically are the ones that are determined to spend the most amount of time with the planning function. Some of the top Fortune 500 companies, there is a very distinct correlation between them and the amount of planning that they do for the development of new products or expansion or any of the objectives that they're trying to do. After you've figured out what all of your planning is going to entail, you move into organizing, which is to figure out how to put your staff by departments, by geographic location, by product design. However you are going to produce the product or service, you have to figure out, from a management perspective, what best organizational structure would lead to the greatest level of effectiveness and efficiency. Once the planning is done and the organization is established, then the managers have to lead, motivate, make sure that the people have an idea of what they're trying to do. And ultimately, the last step is to control the work that they're doing to ensure that they're performing at a high enough level to be able to establish and retain a competitive advantage. As noted, planning is essentially the preparation done before pursuing any type of goal or objective, in fact, even to establish what the goals and objective are. So the steps would be to decide which goals you want to pursue, what is your company's main objectives, what are you trying to accomplish, then figuring out how are you going to be able to get those goals met, and figure out what kind of resources you're going to need, what type of money, what type of equipment, what type of employees, what type of skills are they going to require, which customers are you trying to reach out to. All of that needs to be done ahead of time. And again, I can't really emphasize enough how important planning is. If you are going to build a house or plan a party or a vacation or bake a cake, anything that you do, you should be doing some level of planning, because if you just tried to build a house by going to Home Depot and buying a lot of stuff and then trying to throw it together, it's probably not going to work very well. And whatever does work, you're probably going to run into some problems that would be harder to fix because you haven't mapped out all of the potential outcomes. If you have blueprints, if you know which piece needs to come first, if you spend time planning out how the project is going to go, you'll know the timeframes that you need, you'll know and identify which resources you're going to have, and you can follow the plan once it's established. If anything goes wrong, part of the planning process is also to come up with some contingency planning. So if I'm not able to get a particular piece of equipment, what can I do? Being ready for that eventuality or potential consequence is very important, because if you don't have any plan for unexpected turns of events, then it's going to be difficult for you to be able to, on the fly, figure out how to address it. As noted, when you create the organizational structure for an entity, whatever business that you're working for, you need to be able to put it into some type of a structure that makes sense. Some companies have different departments. You have a marketing department, you have an engineering department, you have a customer service and sales department, legal department. That's typically a very common way of doing it. You could also decide to organize your company or your entity by geography. Maybe you have a North American office, maybe you have a European office. You could break up your company into function, what they're doing in terms of their product or the service that they're providing. If you're a company like Samsung, you may have a cell phone division, a telephone division, a heavy equipment division, an appliance division. Whatever makes the most amount of sense. There's no perfect answer for that. It's really part of the strategic planning process of management to figure out what makes the most amount of sense in terms of getting the greatest level of efficiency and effectiveness from the organizational structure that's created. The organizational structure is a formal system. It is established by management. And if you've worked for a company and have ever seen an organizational chart, that's usually the outcome of it. It's mapped out. You'll have the CEO at the top. And if you go by divisions, they'll explain what the reporting structure is. You'll try to create some level of efficiency. So if research and development needs to work with operations and marketing, maybe there's some dotted lines, maybe you put them by product so that they all work together and there's no obstacles to people being able to get the resources and communication access to information that they need. To be a leader is different than being a manager in the strict sense. At the least level, being a manager is simply making sure that people show up to work, that they clock in, that they follow policies, that they get paid, that they produce a certain amount. That's kind of the oversight of the work process. Not all managers are leaders. It would be ideal if they were. Being a leader is someone that's basically able to use their experience, their skill, their interpersonal characteristics to be able to inspire other people and to create a level of energy where they want to follow someone. I mean, being a leader implies that people want to follow you. You could think you're a leader, and if nobody really has any interest in doing what you say because you lack either the communication abilities or you don't have the level of respect because you don't have a high enough level of experience or skill, there's a lot of people that I've met that believe they're great leaders, but the leadership really shines through by the results that come from it. If you are a good leader, you're able to treat your employees in a way where they want to follow you. The controlling function really is more of an administrative function. It typically comes down to looking at metrics. If you're in a manufacturing concern, what level of productivity, how is the level of quality combined with the level of productivity, how much money are we spending on it, how much are people individually producing, are people showing up on time? This goes into more of the management process that we're talking about rather than the leadership part. Part of controlling, if you've been in the workforce, you've probably had the quarterly or annual reviews where you sit down and talk to people and you try to establish what you want them to be doing. You talk about what kind of training they could get, look for areas where you could improve, look for enhancing or solidifying the things that the employees do well, and then talking about what the expectations are so that they can actually perform at a satisfactory level. A department is part of the structure of an organization, as we discussed. Typically, it's simply defined as a group of people who work together. So like I said, if you have a marketing department, you typically have people who are involved in marketing. If you have an accounting department or a finance department, you group people together who have the same type of skills and knowledge so that you can get some level of cooperation rather than having people of a similar work background sprinkled out throughout the company. By putting them together, they can work together to accomplish the specific things that group of people is supposed to be able to accomplish for the greater good of the entire organization. Even within departments, however, you're going to have different levels of management. And the first line managers, these are basically your supervisors. It could be multiple levels of management even within a division. There could be higher levels of management covering different divisions or departments. But frontline managers are typically, the lowest level above your rank and file employee. They're going to be looking at the daily supervision of people who are not managers themselves. Middle managers have the next level of oversight. They typically would have a span of control of several direct reports, probably maybe 4 or 5 or 6 first-line managers would report to one middle manager. Typically, that would still be within one department, although depending on the way the company's been organized, you could have multiple departments with different first-line managers reporting to middle managers. The first-line managers are largely responsible for mostly things like control and overseeing the work and the productivity of the people that are subordinate to them. Middle managers are looking more towards higher-end decisions, higher-end strategy to make sure that the first-line managers and their employees have all of the resources necessary to be put into a position to succeed. Top managers, sometimes referred to as senior managers, these are people up at, the CEO level or the CFO, CIO, general counsel, higher levels of the organization. They're looking more at the strategy rather than the actual execution of what the company's doing on a daily basis. They're looking at the bigger picture plans. They're looking more at where do we want to be in 2, 5, or 10 years, whether we issue new stock, whether we expand. These are decisions that top managers are making, and they usually go from a top-down managerial style. They'll come up with a strategy, they'll leave it to the middle managers to figure out how to resource it correctly, and then they will instruct the first-line managers how to have the workers actually implement the things that are necessary to fulfill the purposes of the strategy that's been decided by the top-level managers. This graphic on slide 16 simply shows the levels of managers that use the managerial pyramid. Below the pyramid would be your non-managerial employees, and you got the first-line managers overseeing them, then the middle managers, then the top managers, and of course the chief executive officer. If you're in a corporation structure, they would have authority over all of the management beneath them. The next slide has a graphic just showing the difference between the planning, organizing, leading, and controlling functions of the different types of managers. No surprise, the planning is usually left for the top managers. It doesn't mean that the other managers aren't doing some planning, but the higher level you are, the more focused you are on strategic things like planning and setting the organizational structure for the entire entity. Lower level managers, first line managers, middle managers, they do spend more time with leading because they have the direct relationship with the employees that they're dealing with. Certainly, first line managers have a lot more time dealing with leading and to some extent controlling than top line managers do. Top line managers in this chart do have a reasonable amount of controlling, but it's not that they're controlling the employees of the first line managers. They're controlling the middle managers, and the middle managers are controlling the work of the first line managers, and so on. The top management team, you'll see initialisms such as CEO, which is Chief Executive Officer. As I stated, in a corporation, if you've taken an Introduction to Business or Business Dynamics course, if you're talking about a corporation that is a legal entity that is created, the CEO is elected by the board of directors in a corporation. If you're not in a corporation, you could be the president or some other title. They may even call you the chief executive officer, but typically CEO implies that you are in a corporate structure. I suppose you could be a CEO of an LLC, which is a limited liability company as well. COO is Chief Operating Officer, so they're overseeing the operations, the administrative functions of the company. You could have a Chief Financial Officer who deals with the money coming in, money going out, investments, stock issues, things like that, to develop enough money to be able to pay the budgets and produce the products and services that you're looking for. There could be a lot of presidents and vice presidents. It really depends on how the company has decided to organize themselves. Titles can change, but they, by and large, have the same kind of function. You may be a president of one company or the CEO of another. It just depends on what terminology that particular organization has decided to use. Managerial skills extend to conceptual, human, and technical skills. Conceptual skills are largely related to critical thinking and decision-making, which again, we will talk about probably next week. The ability to analyze a situation, to assess the cause and effect of it, it basically allows you, as if you were a doctor, you look at the symptoms of what's going on, you're able to deduce using logic what the best course of action would be, and then you are able to come up with a course of action that would be able to correct a problem or to take advantage of an opportunity. Human skills refer to interpersonal abilities, the ability to appreciate other people, to empathize with them, to understand what makes them tick, to have a high level of emotional intelligence so that you understand the proper way to interact with people to get the most out of them. And then technical skills refers to, acquired knowledge and skills that allows you to actually perform the role. If you know nothing about engineering and you are the manager of an engineering department, you are obviously going to run into some problems because your employees are going to be speaking a vocabulary and participating in work that you don't understand. You have to have at least some level of technical skills to be able to appreciate the type of work that is being done, to be able to provide the appropriate resources and leadership to your team. Related to conceptual, human, and technical skills is communication abilities. If you can provide the appropriate information, it makes it a lot easier to get people to understand what is expected of them. If you look at a problem using your conceptual skills, and then you have to talk to people and employ some technical jargon, the ability to communicate with them appropriately at a level that they understand it and can appreciate it with sufficient detail, it's going to be very important. If you're not good at communicating any of these things, you could have the greatest conceptual skills, you could be very good dealing with people, but if you can't tell them what's expected of them, if you can't explain to them the rationale for what they're trying to do, it's going to be hard for you to get them to buy into it and really exhibit that type of leadership capability where they want to follow what it is that you're trying to get them to do. Part of technical skills also includes a reference to core competency. If you've never heard that term before, you will hear it for the rest of your life if you stay in business. It is basically the type of knowledge, skills, and abilities, often referred to as KSAs. Here on the slide, they talk about skills, abilities, and experiences. It basically means that you are good at the things that you are required to be good at a level that is better than the competition, which allows you to have a competitive advantage and perform at a higher level than they are and be more profitable ultimately. The next slide, I'm just going to let you take a look at the types and levels of managers and the type of things that they do. Restructuring is one of the things that can happen in management. It doesn't necessarily always mean downsizing. Very frequently it does. Downsizing is simply shedding a number of employees. Employees can be very expensive depending on the type of work that you do. It could be anywhere from 5 to 10% to up to 80% of the expense of a company. If you're a service company, employee expenses are very high. So if you can reduce the number of employees because they are not relevant any longer, they're doing work that is obsolete, or you can replace them potentially with AI or automated computer systems or robotics, that's what a lot of companies actually try to do. You can also do a restructuring without downsizing, where you're reducing expenditures by eliminating people. You could actually just put those people in a different context, in a different location, and give them different responsibilities, which would be able to take advantage of efficiencies from reorganizing and restructuring. But very typically, it does mean that they're going to change the management structure. Top and middle managers typically have been around for a long time, and even though they have a lot of experience, they tend to be quite expensive. So if you think that you can, as an entity, as an organization, save some money because you have some redundancy, then having a reduction via a restructuring is one thing that you could do. If you are involved in a merger or an acquisition, a merger is when two companies form a brand new entity, or if you have an acquisition, which is when one company takes over another, that is almost guaranteed to provide with some level of restructuring, but the intent is the same. You are trying to expand your customer base and expand your sales capacity by merging or acquiring another company. When you do that, however, you don't need to have two CFOs. You don't need to have 6 different middle managers covering the same area. So the restructuring from a merger or an acquisition would accomplish the same thing via downsizing. You would increase your customer base and you would be able to provide a higher level of efficiency because you don't need to have these duplicative systems in place any longer. Outsourcing is one way that you can reduce expenditures. It's simply signing a contract with another company to do some type of a function that you used to do on your own. If you're a smaller to mid-sized company, you may have had an accountant, you may have even had an accounting team to do your payroll and to get the account statements ready for taxes. It may be cheaper, rather than paying someone a salary and paying their benefits, to hire a company that specializes in it. Rather than creating that level of expertise within your company, it may be cheaper for you to go and do it somewhere else. If you are a rent-a-car company, you could have your own mechanics, but it may be cheaper for you to just hire a company that is focused on doing car repairs. That's typically the type of consequences that need to be reviewed in order to make that decision. The point of outsourcing is it increases efficiency by lowering costs and freeing up resources to pursue other important aspects of the company. I do want to say one thing about downsizing, and that is that there have been studies that show that companies that regularly resort to downsizing to respond to the general economic environment, let's say there's a downturn in the economy and their first reaction is to lay off employees to cut costs, they typically over the long term don't perform at a high level. The reason is that the economy is cyclical. Typically, you may have 5 to 7 years of growth, and you may experience a recession or a contraction of growth for various reasons. It could be just a built-in cycle. It could be because of external factors like a shortage of natural resources or a pandemic, let's say. Some companies are able to take advantage of the naturally occurring economic cycles. When the economy is growing, your business grows, and you have pressure to hire more people to be able to handle the increase in customers. When there's a downturn, companies often lay off those skilled employees that they've just spent this time training. And when the economy starts to pick up again, they start chasing the economic curve. They have to scramble to hire people that they used to have in order to replicate a resource that they already had. Companies that are able to minimize the level of downsizing can keep experienced employees on hand, either by doing things like job sharing, splitting up jobs, giving unpaid time off, whatever it may be for the short term, so that when the economy starts to recover, they can go back to full-time, and you don't have to go and find these new employees. You can very quickly take advantage of the growing economy and have a competitive advantage over the rest of the market because your employees are already skilled and capable of dealing with the issues that are arising, while the competitors who have already downsized might be going out and trying to hire people and take the time and expense to train them up. Empowerment is a tool that has been discussed quite a bit over the last couple of decades. It simply means that you're giving employees the ability to make decisions on their own. I think if you've ever had a job, you've probably experienced what it's like to have a micromanager, someone who looks at every single thing that you do, and if you don't do it exactly the way they told you, they have a problem with it. In most cases, there's probably many ways of accomplishing the same objective. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the way as somebody else does it or exactly the way that your manager wants it. If your manager is the only source of ideas, if your manager does not rely on the employees who do this work every day and probably could be a really good source for coming up with solutions to problems, if you can extend that to your employees, they become more invested in the work. If you are the victim of a micromanaging leader and you basically just have to do what you're told and you have no input, it very quickly becomes easy for you to become disenchanted with the job, to become bored, to kind of tune out. If you have a boss, however, that asks for your input, that gives you some leeway to make decisions, that gives you the capacity to oversee your own work, you will probably feel more valued to the company because they trust you enough to make these types of decisions. If you give someone some training, if you give them responsibilities and basically let them grow into that type of responsibility, then you're more likely to have a satisfied employee base that would be performing at a higher level of productivity. Self-managed teams are another form of empowerment. You basically put a group of people together. Hopefully you do a good job of selecting the team, and you leave it up to them to figure out how to go about organizing the team, controlling and supervising their own activities. Oftentimes, when a team is well managed, if you put 5 people on a team, they can produce more work than those 5 could have done on their own. You have this synergy that comes from people working together. That's on a well-managed team. If you are a manager that does not know how teams operate particularly well and you just throw people together and say, take care of this, and you don't give them any direction, you don't really explain to them what it's like to be on a team, and you don't give them the appropriate training, studies have found that teams that are poorly managed actually perform at a lower level than they would have if they were on their own. The whole point of having a team is to create this level of efficiency that you can get from people working synergistically together. If you don't have the capacity or the skill set for them to be able to do that, you may be actually reducing productivity and efficiency by having a poorly managed team. Challenges for management in a global environment include the IT and e-commerce effects, the rise of global organizations, issues regarding a competitive advantage, ethics and social responsibility, and managing a diverse workforce. First thing I want to talk about is a competitive advantage. That simply means that an organization that has a competitive advantage can outperform its competition because it either has better people, better systems, better materials, whatever it may be. It is something that cannot be replicated by the competition. Even if the competition works at the best of its potential efficiency, if you have a competitive advantage, you are still going to be able to perform at a higher level. If I were going to create a basketball team, the nature of the game is that people who are tall typically have an advantage. If I have the best group of basketball players in the world, but they're 5'8", and someone else has a group of basketball players who are pretty good, but they happen to be 6'8" to 7 feet tall, the competitive advantage of simply having the right people in the right context would give it to the team with the taller players, even if they don't happen to be the best for their size. That's kind of what we're talking about with a competitive advantage. If you hire employees that are better than your competition and you can retain them, they won't be working for the competition, and you cannot replicate that very easily, at least. If you are always on top of the newest technology, if you're always trying to, through a recursive process of trying to get better on a continual basis, you will have an advantage over the competition. One of the things about competitive advantage is that things change so frequently. It really means that you need to always be looking at improving the people that you hire, training them, improving the processes that you have, making sure that you have the most up-to-date and the best fit for the equipment and tools that you're using, because if you don't do it, the competition is probably going to do it and try to gain an advantage over you. So establishing the competitive advantage is very difficult, but once you get it, you have to keep working in order to retain it, because if you stay still, chances are your advantage would be eroded by the efforts of the competition. The building blocks of a competitive advantage, we talked about effectiveness already, but obviously efficiency, if you can do things at a lesser expensive resources, time, money, people, production processes, etc., then you are going to have an advantage over those that don't have that same level of efficiency. If you can come up with new ideas, which could be tied to efficiency as well, if you have an innovative idea about becoming more efficient, if you have an innovative idea about coming up with a product that your consumers want that the competition doesn't have yet, that's going to be part of your competitive advantage. If you can provide high levels of customer service, which in my opinion has been really falling by the wayside as of late, it's an expensive thing to do, but if you really wanted to carve a niche for yourself in the industry, if you are responsive to your customers and you give them what they need and the competition does not, your customers will come back to you rather than the competition. And if you also have something at a high level of quality, which coupled with efficiency means that you're going to be getting a good level product, a good performing product, a high quality product for a very competitive or maybe even lower than the competitive market price, that's going to give you an advantage. If the competition creates a product and I have a product that's better at the same price, they're going to buy our product. If I have a product that's better and is cheaper, they're going to buy our product all the time. And it doesn't matter unless the competition figures out a way to make a better product or to make it cheaper, I'm going to have a competitive advantage. But I need to be cognizant of the fact that the competition is always going to try to improve in order to usurp our position as having a competitive advantage. As noted, innovation is coming up with new or improved goods or business processes that allow you to become more effective and efficient. Turnaround management is when you are in a situation where you do not have a competitive advantage and you need to shake things up. You would bring in somebody that would really try to restructure the way things are being done. Turnaround management is closely associated with a process called business process reengineering, where you look at everything that the company is doing and try to figure out if you're doing the right thing. If you're doing the right thing, is there a way that you could potentially do it better? Are you getting access to the proper people? Do they have the proper amount of training? Do they have the right amount of experience? Are the raw materials that you're using to create your product at a high enough level of quality? Are you buying them at a cheap enough rate so that you can have a competitive price? Turnaround management is not necessarily a last resort, but it is an acknowledgement that there's some major changes that need to be made in order to come up with a better use of the resources, become more competitive, and try to build that competitive advantage. Ethical and social responsibility standards are important. Typically, companies that perform at a high level of ethics and social responsibility and are perceived as having a high level of ethics and social responsibility tend to be more profitable. It's a relatively slight correlation, but it is a correlation. You can avoid lawsuits. Being unethical doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something illegal, but it can open the door to lawsuits from customers, from other companies, and maybe even the government if they believe that you're violating some type of anti-competitive processes or laws. If you have a high level of ethics, people would appreciate it. It can help retain customers. People tend to want to buy products from companies that they believe are being produced by a company that is not causing any undue harm to its employees or to the environment or to other people around them. Managing a diverse workforce extends to basic ideas of what diversity is, but it's important to note that diversity means any type of difference. One particular type of difference today that didn't exist 2 or 3 generations ago is age diversity. You've got baby boomers today, people who were born between 1946 and 1964 who are still in the marketplace. They're in their 60s and some of them are in their 70s. They may be working with people as young as their teens or recent college graduates in their early 20s. It tends to be a little bit of an unusual thing. People tended to retire earlier, whether they're working longer because they have to or because we're healthier. You have a lot more diversity in terms of age. And if you grew up in a particular time before the internet or before cell phones, before computers, you may have learned how to do things in a particular way. You may need to adapt. If you grew up with things like cell phones and the internet and computers, you may not understand how to apply certain things that you haven't been exposed to that could give you an advantage in effectiveness and efficiency. So the idea of having a diverse workforce in terms of age and experience doesn't mean that it's necessarily a challenge. It definitely is. But if you have an open dialogue between people, you can take those differences and use it to come up with greater numbers of ideas. You can use it as a generator of ideas and innovation that other companies, if they're not doing, may not be able to access. The United States is also a very diverse country. It's among, if not the most diverse country in the world. It's highly diverse, and as recently as a few years ago, maybe 2014, 2015, census data for the first time indicated that new births had no majority racial background. Prior to that, European, Caucasian, white Americans were the majority. They still consist of over 70% of the population. But if you look at new births, as of, like I said, about 2015, there is no one racial or ethnic group that is beyond 50% in terms of births. The consequences for that mean that by around 2050, by the middle of the century, the United States will be a minority-majority country. Minority simply means less than 50%. So if there is no group, no ethnicity, no race, whatever terminology you would want to use, there is not going to be one that is in the majority, that is over 50%. That is representative of an extremely diverse workforce and a diverse country. If you can take advantage of those differences by getting these different ideas, by getting these different viewpoints, by having employees that belong to a particular ethnicity that can help you sell to that particular group of people in the country, that is a way to harness diversity for an effective competitive advantage. If you are a company that allows the diversity of its employees to create a barrier or roadblock or become a source of controversy, then you are going to have a difficult time managing your employees, and you're not going to get that benefit of innovation and responsiveness to what is, in fact, a very diverse country. If you have a very diverse workforce in a very diverse country and you are able to utilize them appropriately, you're going to have a competitive advantage over a company that does not do the same. It is simply a matter of statistics at this point. The United States, as I noted, is a very diverse country. If you have a company that is able to respond to that level of diversity in an effective manner, then you're going to have a competitive advantage. One thing about IT and e-commerce, it's important to note what Moore's Law is. You may have heard about it from another course. If you don't, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here. You can Google it. Moore's Law is basically a maxim that states that technology in the form of computing power basically doubles every 18 to 24 months. What that means over a course of a couple of decades, it's been around for about 50 years, is that computers today are hundreds, if not thousands of times more powerful than they were previously. If you think about the advent of video games in the 1970s, they had Pong. It would be a ball that went from one side to the other. If you're like Madden football, you could look at the early versions of Madden compared to what they have today. The level of graphics is amazing, streaming video services, communications. The level of computing power today is astonishing, and it is happening at an ever-increasing rate because it's exponentially growing faster. When you have IT that is growing at that level, you have to have the ability of having employees to be able to learn new skills, to be able to understand the capacity of this new IT. The other thing about e-commerce is it ties very closely to global economy issues. If you're able to more effectively use IT to bring your people together through online virtual interactions by having document sharing, it can really increase the efficiency of your organization, but only if you understand the opportunities afforded to you and if you provide the training and the capacity for your employees to be able to use that type of new innovative IT to be able to take advantage of it. The advances in IT are only going to be effective if you have management that can appreciate the opportunities that are afforded to it, and if you allow your employees to become educated through training and other things and exposure to it so that they can use these new tools. Again, this goes towards a competitive advantage. If you are able to embrace technology and utilize new cutting-edge technology and keep your employees up to speed, then they will have an advantage over companies that do not do the same. Just a final word on the global or the globalization of the economy. That is done largely by advances in the internet. Previously, 30, 40 years ago, if you had a Boston company, your competition would be mainly in the Boston area, maybe in the East Coast. You could have a very small company now and face competition internationally because of IT. People from other countries could sell in your market and sell the same thing. So the level of competition that requires good management and the idea and understanding of what it actually takes to create a competitive advantage is really enhanced by the fact that globalization has led to competition on levels that had not been seen in previous generations. That's the end of chapter 1.